The law that created the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, it says very clearly that you can't change anything outside of the institution without congressional approval. My uncle, John F. Kennedy, this was something that Congress put in his name really as an active memorial to celebrate and recognize the love in this country for this fallen president. It's in the law, not allowed to have anybody else's name on it. It would also be illegal for Obama to do it, or Clinton, or anybody else. Of course, they didn't try, but it's not actually legal.
The tarp that's been hanging over the facade, it does feel like a perfect symbol of Trump's insecurity that he needs to hide the fact that his name has to come off the building.
Yeah, what are they hiding back there?
Hello and welcome to Obsessed, the podcast. I'm Matt Wilstein from The Daily Beast, and my guest on the show today may be a member of America's most famous political family, but she is also an accomplished documentary filmmaker in her own right. She won an Emmy for the HBO documentary Ghosts of Abu Ghraib and was nominated for an Oscar for her film Last Days in Vietnam. Her latest, streaming now on Netflix, is Freefall, A Reckoning for Boeing, which made me more scared than I'd like to admit about getting on an airplane anytime soon. Rory Kennedy, welcome to Obsessed, the podcast.
Great to be here with you, Matt.
Thank you so much for doing this. This is your second film now that you've made about Boeing and all of the many problems there. How did you get interested in this subject in the first place?
Well, I got interested in it really by just reading what was going on and seeing. This was now back 5 or 6 years ago when the 737 MAX crashes happened, and it was two of the same model of aircraft that had crashed within 5 months of each other, killing 346 people. Initially, Boeing had said that it was a pilot error, and then with more investigations, both congressional investigations as well as wonderful journalists, it became evident that it was a lot more complicated than that. And ultimately, there was, Boeing acknowledged its own fault in the MCAS system, and the plane was grounded, and there was a number of fixes made to the aircraft. And that's really when the Downfall documentary ended, and with promises from Boeing that they had learned their lesson and had changed their ways, and they, made great assurances to the flying public, to Congress, to the airlines. And yet then in the aftermath of the plane actually getting back into the air, I started seeing a lot of the same issues that had led to the 737 MAX crashes, and was compelled to make another film.
So this new film, Freefall, you open with the very dramatic scene that sort of teases the tragic fate of whistleblower John Barnett, who I know you became close with, working on the first film. Why did you want to start there and then make his story so central to this second film?
Yeah. Well, I had become friendly with John after making Downfall, and I was very upset when I learned that he had died. And he had died under suspicious circumstances where he was in the midst of a deposition with Boeing lawyers, when he was found dead. And I was very immediately in touch with his family, and working with them in the aftermath of that, and just kind of being on the journey with them. And then around that same time, the Alaska Airlines window blowout happened. And in the midst of all this and sort of leading up to it, there had been a number of instances that I was seeing in the news of engines lighting on fire in the middle of a airplane journey, landing gear falling off of airplanes, smoke filling cabins. There was just actually another instance of a window blowing out of Ryanair, which was a Boeing airplane a few weeks ago. So anyway, these instances were happening over and over again, and then when John died, a number of other whistleblowers approached me to say, not only was everything that John said was true, but that the situation had gotten even worse. And they were seeing very alarming instances of activities that were not following protocols and were very concerning to them in terms of the safety of flight. And would I please consider coming back and doing, another film about this? And so, it's a combination of all of those things. And I made the first film with Imagine, Ron Howard's company, and we collectively approached Netflix, and they were on board immediately as well to go revisit this subject. So, I would say that this film, Downfall, was really focused on the story of the 737 MAX and all of the things that had gone wrong to lead to those crashes. And this film is more broadly taking on Boeing itself and looking across a number of models of airplane that suggests that there's something much greater and more systemic happening within the company. Um, and that's the focus of this film.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it even more terrifying in a lot of ways because you could look at that first film and say, okay, maybe I can avoid this one aircraft, which I know is something that you've said that you've done. But now it feels like, well, it's not just that one aircraft, and there's more to it. The sequence that you mentioned of the Alaska Airlines flight with the where the window blows out, I mean, that was one of the most terrifying, harrowing things that I've seen on screen in a long time. Knowing that it's real and you're seeing this real footage that people took with their phones that you were able to collect, from inside the plane. What did you think when you sort of saw that and got that footage and were started to put that together? Because it's terrifying.
Well, it's scary. It's scary being inside the airplane when, you're there and you're kind of through the perspective of families who are there with their children, and you kind of, it's, to me, enormously relatable. And then, they look, there's a huge blast, and then they look to the left and it's just open sky, and then you can see the stars, and the cameras are just like pan over and you're like, "Oh my god." But then you're still on the journey with these folks and kind of experiencing what they're going through and reaching out to their families and sending these texts that they think are the last time they'll be in touch with their families, or from the perspective of their families at home. And it's heart-wrenching to think about what they went through and how close they were to. I mean, had that plane been 20,000 feet higher, I'm not sure anybody would have survived that. So it's scary. And that was an instance where um manufacturing, they just didn't follow the protocols, and they didn't put the screws back into the door in the right way. And, yeah, actually, they just didn't put them in. They weren't in there, and it just, eventually blew out. And there's so many other instances where whistleblowers have come to me, and that you kind of experience as you watch the film, where protocols are not followed. And you don't know if, well, is it on this plane that I'm on now, or is it on another plane? And it's so widespread, that it's pretty scary. And then, over and over again across many factories, these whistleblowers saying the same things about using scrap parts that have been considered defunct. These do not work. Put them aside into this closet where nobody can get them, and they're going into the closet, they're taking out these parts, and they're putting them into the airplanes that we're getting on. Like, that should not happen.
Was there a single discovery on this film that really floored you the most, or that you just couldn't believe that you were finding it out?
I mean, I think one of the kind of more disturbing moments is with the undercover footage in the South Carolina factory, where a number of people who work at that factory are asked, you know, you can go on a free trip anywhere in the world. You can take your family with you. It's going to be all paid for. The only thing is you have to fly on a 787 Dreamliner, and every one of them is like, "No way. I'm not getting on this airplane." And so, you don't really wanna get on an airplane that the people who are building the airplane won't get on, so that's disturbing. I mean, there's kind of the broad stories of not following the protocols and what they lead to. I mean, there's John's story. There's so many across the film, but there's John's story about the oxygen mask not working, and that's like you see him, John Barnett, the whistleblower who died, and we were able to secure the footage that nobody's seen and hasn't been out in the world of his deposition, in which he is, voices concern about the oxygen mask not working, and the Boeing lawyer pushes back with him, and you see him saying, "No, this is actually true, and then we did this study, and then the study's there, and you can see in 25% of the oxygen masks don't work," and then you're inside the airplane in Alaska, and the oxygen masks don't work, so it's 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 real, and it's stunning, and it's disturbing, and you really feel what the implication is of what these whistleblowers are saying and what they're voicing, and that, you know, we need to heed their advice.
The climax of the film really is John Barnett's apparent suicide, which you said is, under suspicious circumstances, his death. It was during the time that he was sort of set to go back to keep doing his, his deposition, his testimony about what was going on. After, getting to know him and talking to people around him and doing this film, what do you think happened to John Barnett?
Well, I think that what, his lawyer says at the end of the film is true, which is even if Boeing didn't kill John Barnett, they're responsible for his death. Um, I think there is a lot of truth to that, and, um, have a lot of time with John, talking to him and, seeing his recordings and deposition about Boeing and what they put him through, and it's heart-wrenching, and I think the film, captures a good bit of that, and you're really on the journey of him throughout the film and kind of, um, I think I hope, really appreciate his humanity and his intention. One of the things that was, evident to me in making the film is that so many of these whistleblowers, John and so many of the other ones who came forward, some of whom have never testified or spoken before, who are in the film, came forward because of John and were inspired and wanted to continue and his legacy and tell the story he was telling from their own perspective. But you also really, I think, come to appreciate the stakes for these guys because they are threatened, and so many of them have risked losing their job, losing their livelihood, um, being ostracized by the company, being put into a new department that they don't have the expertise or the knowledge in, um, and they're doing it because they care so deeply about the quality of what they're building, and they understand that, people are flying at 30,000 feet, and if these things aren't built well, they're gonna feel responsible for these people dying.
So yeah, I think, at the same time that it galvanized people to come and talk to you, I think it also made them scared to talk to you because understandably a lot of his friends and coworkers didn't want to believe that he would have really, taken his own life. Did you feel that fear from people as well, that they thought, "Oh, if I speak out, if I become a whistleblower like John, then something terrible might happen to me?"
Yes, there were a lot of people who voiced concerns about participating in the film, and in fact, as you saw, one of the whistleblowers in the film talks about how his family didn't want him to participate in the film because they're concerned about what might happen to him as a result. So I think there's, um, certainly, a fear that is, and I think that it's based on a lot of stories, and we were seeing this across different plants and different states and different places where people worked at Boeing, where they did face, significant retribution, um, by speaking out about concerns about safety, you know? So it's unsettling when you're hearing the same story from different people, many of whom don't know each other, who are all corroborating what the others are saying without even necessarily knowing it. And at the end of the day, they are telling us something that's very different than what Boeing's PR is communicating. So it kind of flies in the face. And then when you have the combination of those stories and the humanity and the specificity of their arguments, and then you're seeing incident after incident which supports what they're arguing, playing themselves out in the press, it paints a picture that, is there are a lot of red flags here. There's a lot of like, we need some corrections with this company. We all fly. Can can the company do something about it, or the FAA, the regulatory agency that's supposed to, or the US government? Like, can Congress, like, is anybody doing anything about this? Because it's very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, we see hearings from, Congress, and it's actually kind of remarkable to see it as a bipartisan concern. You have senators on both sides grilling these, Boeing executives, which is great to see. But you do think, okay, they gave them a hard time and they yelled at them a little bit, but are they actually going to do anything? And what would it take to actually affect change at this company and make things safer?
Yeah, well, there's a lot you can do actually. If people were doing their job, then there's a lot you can do. For example, just last month, the one of the things that the congressional hearing after in the aftermath of the 737 Max incident concluded that was part of the problem was that the FAA wasn't doing its job, and the specificity of that incident, which was significant, was allowing Boeing to police itself, to allow Boeing to provide its own airworthiness directives that basically say, "We certify that this plane is airworthy and can go into the sky and it's safe." So, it used to be the FAA created that certification, and then prior to the 737 MAX crashes, they let Boeing do that, and then they stopped letting Boeing do that until last month, and now they're letting Boeing do that again. So that is it just isn't really the role that the FAA is. I mean, the FAA is supposed to do that, and so why is it letting Boeing do that? Because we're in a kind of anti-regulatory, vision, which has consequences, downstream that so yeah, so I think one thing is which is great, is that we have an election cycle coming up this fall, and that people can look at the folks who they're voting for and look at their track record and see if they're pro-regulatory tendencies or anti-regulatory tendencies, and specifically with the FAA. And I think that's a good indicator of who you want in Congress doing the job that they're supposed to do, which is to protect us, the public.
How has making these two films changed your feelings, behavior around flying, in terms of what you're looking for? And do you have advice for people who see this movie, are terrified and don't know what to do now?
Well, I mean, I think people can do a lot in terms of just putting pressure on. I think there's the voting is great, and then I think you can write letters to your member of Congress and to Boeing and to the FAA and encourage them to do their job, maybe to watch this film. And I think that you can also look at what kind of airplane you're booking. They do make that easier now. And, I personally won't fly a 737 MAX or a Dreamliner, and people can come to their own conclusions. And then, there are airlines, not a lot of them in the United States, but I know JetBlue doesn't use Boeing at all. So if you wanna just, like, stay away from Boeing altogether, then you could fly more JetBlue.
Yeah.
I don't get paid by JetBlue, by the way.
You could though. Maybe that's a new career for you. You could be their spokesperson.
Yeah, well,
I want to zoom out a little bit and just talk about your life and career as a filmmaker. I'm curious, when you started doing this, when you decided you wanted to make films, how do you feel like being from the family that you're from and having the name that you have helped you, and how did it kind of maybe hurt you or hold you back in certain ways? Did you feel any of that?
um, well, I think that, uh, there have definitely been probably more doors open to me than other folks because of my family background initially. I think the doors were open, but then I had to kind of keep them open.
Right. You can open the door, but you can't keep it open.
Yeah, you have to kind of prove yourself once you're in the room a bit. So, but it's hard to get in the room. So I appreciate that I was able probably to get into more rooms than other folks. Um, and then, I think mostly it's been very positive in terms of my film career, just also in terms of the subjects and the people whose stories I'm telling, that maybe they're more open to talking to me because of my family connection in certain instances. A lot of times people don't know my family background when I'm starting a new project. So I'm not sure it has played a huge role, but sometimes I think maybe it does. Probably in other instances, people don't wanna talk to me because of it, but, um, I think largely it's been pretty good. I'm happy.
Yeah. No negatives that stand out or that have made things harder in some ways?
N I would focus on the positives more.
I am curious because, I think a lot of your films are socially minded and trying to, whether it's further some cause or just bring attention to something. If you think about what you do as a continuation of sorts of the mission of your father, of your family, because, I know you didn't know your father. People may or may not know that, you were born, I think, 6 months after his assassination, Robert F. Kennedy. But do you think about what you do in that same way of sort of seeking social justice?
I think that we're all very much influenced by the families that we grew up in. And so, I think that I grew up in a family, and of course, there's my father, but also my mother and other wonderful people like, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who's my aunt, who started the Special Olympics, and um, Edward Kennedy was a wonderful senator from Massachusetts, not to mention John F. Kennedy, was a wonderful president. Um, I certainly think I was influenced by my family. And then, I think growing up, my mother and my family, we were really surrounded by kind of extraordinary people, and I was lucky enough at a pretty young age and multiple times in my life to visit places like South Africa and, meet Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and other just like super inspirational people. And I think that we were also surrounded by their stories and other kind of very heroic people. And I think it had an influence on me and who I am and kind of the work that it feels very genuine in terms of what I want to do and trying to highlight other people's stories and amplify them in a way that I think is helpful and contributory. And then I think I also grew up in a family with Irish heritage and storytelling tendencies that also I think probably impacted my path, which is different than most in my family, which is to kind of really focus on storytelling and using stories to help people have a better sense of others' plight.
I do want to ask about your film Ethel, which is just a beautiful film that you made about your mother. And when you made that film, you got to sit down with her and interview her. You interviewed, all of your siblings. What insight and things what did you learn about your mother, about your family doing that project, which is such a unique thing that most people don't get to do, sit down and interview everyone in their family and then, put together a film that tells the story of that person. It's a pretty unique experience in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, I learned that she liked to bet on horses when she was younger.
You didn't know that?
No. Um, we really did love watching the Kentucky Derby when we were little, but I didn't know that it came from that history. I, it's an interesting journey to go on because I think, in life we all grow up and there's not necessarily the opportunity to kind of pause and ask all of the questions of like, "Wait, where did you grow up, and how did you grow up, and what was your parents like, and what was and what was it like when you went through this kind of challenging, difficult thing?" It just sort of life happens and you kind of feel the texture of it, but you don't necessarily ask the direct question. And so there was something, I think, for me about that process that was both difficult and challenging because some of the questions I didn't want to have to ask. Um, but was also eye-opening and sweet. And of course, now that my mother died, almost 2 years ago, having made that film, it feels very, precious to me and sweet. And I remember when she died, we were all on Cape Cod, my family and I had gone over to one of my family members' homes, and then I had come back into my house, and all of my children and the nieces and nephews were all watching Ethel at my house, which they had just kind of done on their own. And there were like 25 of them all, scrunched in the living room watching the film. It was very sweet. It was really sweet. So it's nice to be able to share her story in a way that's accessible and share her to younger generations.
I love the scene that you talk about in that film that some of your siblings talk about how she would, sort of grill everyone around the dinner table about geopolitics or, stories in the news. Um, it is something that was recreated in this, miniseries Love Story, which I'm pretty sure you said you weren't sure you're going to watch, and I have a feeling you haven't watched yet. But it is recreated, I would say, pretty lovingly in that show. That kind of the way that she would do that. Um, what were your memories of that and sort of what that was like to be part of those times around the dinner table when she's asking everybody, questions that you may or may not know from the newspaper?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think um I think that one of the gifts that my mother gave to me and to us as children, is and I think it's kind of runs through our family. My grandmother would do the same, my grandmother Rose, is that it helps you to think about other people instead of yourself. And it's not to say that I think I think, you know, working on yourself is a worthy endeavor that we all need to do a little bit of to to be healthy and well situated in the world. So it's not that I'm opposed to that at all, and I think everybody should do it, but I do think there's something healthy about just focusing your life on trying to kind of make other people's lives better, and actually I think it makes you feel better. Um and so I think that's a gift. And so I think a lot of the focus on what was happening in the world was not just like, can you name, everybody in the cabinet or whatever it was or doing it was really an appreciation for the role that politics can have on the lives of everyday people and how important it was to be able to recognize that so that you can also try to influence large numbers of people in different ways. I mean, that's not to say politics is the only path towards having an impact at all, because you can do it in your living room, in your backyard, in your neighborhood. But looking at these kind of systems and how they trickle down and impact people was a big part of what the learning process was at those dining room tables for us, for me.
But in the moment, was it as intimidating as it seems to try to answer these questions about things that were happening in the world?
Well, you definitely wanted to go to the dining room table having read the paper and kind of having a sense of what was going on. But it was also fun to know facts that other people didn't know and to, be equipped in these ways. So it 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 worked both ways.
Yeah. So, like most of your family, I think you made the difficult decision, I assume, to speak out against your brother, RFK Jr., who is very much in the news every day in this Trump administration. Was that a really a difficult decision to do that, or did it seem like the obvious thing to do, or how did you think about just how to speak about that situation publicly?
I would say that I'm a believer in science and expertise. And so and medicine and kind of medical professionals. And so I feel very strongly that having people who have a background in the work they do is super important for the knowledge to then be effective at your job and to be able to put protocols in place that are going to minimize any misery and death and will maximize health and well-being. So I think it's a really important job and really important to have somebody in that position who really has a full life's history of doing it. Bringing it back to Freefall, which I really love to talk about. Um, you see with free fall, the folks who historically were running Boeing were engineers when the company was extraordinary and, was making amazing airplanes and making, and doing things that nobody else had done. And I think that when you see people who are brought into the company that have a greater expertise in making money and just being CEOs, but, may have run a company that oversees dishwashers, that it reduces the level of quality. And so I think that it's really important to have people who are in positions who really know what they're doing. And I feel very strongly about that.
The one other news story that I did want to ask you about is this, because it just happened, is that the Kennedy Center board has now said they plan to defy a federal judge and put Donald Trump's name on the building despite being told to take it off. So I'm wondering if you had a reaction to that.
Yeah, I'm opposed to it.
Yeah. Simple as that.
Well, no, I mean, I'll talk about it for a moment, but, if you read um, the law that created the, John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, it says very clearly that you can't change the name of the institution, and you can't change anything on the mantle or outside of the institution, without congressional approval. And so, to me, it's an affront to the Kennedy Center and to the arts. But my uncle John F. Kennedy, this was something that Congress put in his name, really, as a memorial, not unlike the Lincoln Memorial, but it wanted to be an active memorial. But it was really meant to celebrate and to recognize the love in this country for this pretty spectacular fallen president. But so, all of those things are unsettling, but I think the thing that's most upsetting about it, honestly, is that it's in the law, not meant to not allowed to have a unilateral decision by the president to put his or anybody else's name on it. Would also be illegal for Obama to do it, or Clinton, or anybody else.
Of course, they didn't try.
Of course, they didn't try, but it's not actually legal. And so we have 3 systems of government that are supposed to look after each other and make sure that nobody oversteps. And this is a clear example of overstepping. So my hope is that Congress pushes back and does its job, which is, if they want to rename the Kennedy Center, then put it to a vote. But the president cannot do this in and of himself, and the judges have made it clear that he can't do that. And so, I'm confident that the system will play itself out the way it's supposed to, but I think it's consuming a lot of resources and time that feels ill-spent and feels like it's overreach.
Yeah, I don't know what you made of the tarp that's been hanging over the facade, but it does feel like a kind of a perfect symbol of Trump's insecurity, that he needs to hide the fact that his name has to come off the building.
Yeah. What are they hiding back there?
Before we end, I want to run through a few sort of bigger picture reflection questions. Just thinking about your career, what would you go back and tell yourself when you were just starting out, just making films, that you really wish you had known about what it is to do this work?
Listen, listen, listen. I think it's really important to hear people's stories, understand what's the larger story, understand a range of perspective, and really go, the idea of a documentary, kind of the original thought about it is like it's a document. It's something that can be preserved and preserve something in time. And I think it's important to get the firsthand accounts and preserve that, to listen and to encapsulate it in a way that hopefully resonates right now, but also is something people can come back to 30 years from now, and is not like an interpretation of something, but is the actual original to the degree that that's possible. And I think in this day and age, as we're seeing kind of AI and new information that's not necessarily fact-based or truthful, uh, intrude upon what we're learning, that reverting back to the original documentation is really important.
When you look back at your career, is there a project that you just really wanted to make that got away for some reason that you just weren't able to do, that you just have some feeling like, oh, I really wanted to make that one work, but we couldn't do it?
I feel pretty good about the films I've made, and I feel like most pretty much, the films that I really chased after and really wanted to tell the stories, I've been able to do that. So, there's a lot more that I wanna do and a lot of stories out there that are deserving to be told. So I'm not done yet.
That was kind of my next question. Yeah, is there a something on your career bucket list, a subject, a type of film, something that you just have always wanted to do that you haven't gotten to do yet, but you still want to do?
I'm I'm planning on still doing them, so
So you can't talk about them.
yeah, I can't talk about them.
Maybe broad strokes, like the type of thing or the type of figure that I don't know, anything that clues.
I mean, I'll say that I do I love films like this that are giving insight from kind of the inside out of a situation that I think has got very significant implications. So I love this kind of storytelling. I recently just made a film called Queen of Chess, which was about the greatest female chess player in the world, that is also for on Netflix right now, and that was really fun. That's kind of more story oriented, but it was also kind of finding a story that I felt like people didn't know about, but, like, had great footage and was kind of, very dramatic and also very deserving, um, and kind of insightful. So, I'm always looking for those kinds of stories too, where it's just like, this is got a lot checks a lot of boxes, um, and is in the kind of untold category. So, I feel like there's still a lot out there and looking forward to tackling it.
We'll end with this one. They say that you should never meet your heroes. I'm sure you have gotten to meet a lot of them over the years. Do you have a story that either proves that saying right or wrong?
I feel like I love meeting my heroes, and I have been lucky enough to meet a lot of them over the years. And, some of my heroes are more well-known people. I mentioned Nelson Mandela, and Desmond Tutu, who are certainly high up there. But, my heroes are also my children, and who have taught me so much, and family members. And sometimes my hero is walking down the street and I see somebody do something so kind and so profound and so sweet, or in the subway, and they become my heroes for that little instance. So I think we're surrounded by them, thankfully.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Freefall, A Reckoning for Boeing is streaming now on Netflix. Rory Kennedy, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, great talking to you.
All right. I want to thank Rory Kennedy again so much for taking the time for that conversation. I really enjoyed talking with her, and I definitely recommend checking out her documentary on Boeing on Netflix now, but maybe not if you want to fly on an airplane anytime soon. If you're enjoying this podcast, please make sure you are following our YouTube channel at The Obsessed Channel, where you can see videos of all of our episodes. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think of the show, and please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a rating and review there as well. Thank you so much to our producer, Rachel Passer, and we'll be back with an all-new episode of Obsessed the Podcast very soon.